Good day. Today is Monday, 20th January 2025, and we are in the last hours of Joe Biden's presidency, and in a few hours' time, Donald Trump will once again be president of the United States. Now, I suppose, since we are in the dying days of an old administration, and since this is a program, a channel that deals with geopolitical questions, I ought to set out my own views and perhaps summarize the story of the Biden administration. I'm not going to pretend I find it a very distasteful exercise to do so, and I'm going to devote to it as short a time as I can. I will simply say this. It's absolutely clear to me that this administration, the administration that is now exiting, took what was already a very difficult situation in the international system and brought it rapidly to crisis. It played an instrumental role in intensifying and worsening the two big military conflicts that we have seen, the one in Europe, in Ukraine, and the other one in the Middle East. It further damaged relationships with the two other great powers, China and Russia, which have never been worse with the United States at any time since the end of the Cold War. It increased tensions over Taiwan. I find it impossible to think, in fact, of a single area of the world, a single topic in international relations, in which the current administration made things better. That is a pretty dramatic statement, but I think it is a true one. Above all, like other US presidents, but perhaps more extremely than most other US presidents, the exception being, to some extent, Donald Trump, this administration, the Biden administration, ever since the end of the Cold War, has not understood what, in my opinion, is the single most important thing about the conduct of foreign policy. This is that the overriding priority in foreign policy, especially for a country like the United States, which stands at the center of the international system, which it has largely created, and which is the major beneficiary of that system. The priority of its foreign policy should be to preserve peace. Now, the Biden administration has never understood that. It has never understood the importance of maintaining peace, and it has never understood either that when, as inevitably happens, crises take place in the world, given the overriding necessity, priority, imperative to not only preserve peace, when there is a crisis, when conflict begins, the priority should be to restore it. This is something this administration has never at any point in time understood. Instead, it has chosen to wage proxy wars against Russia, another great power, in Ukraine. It has worsened the situation with China, setting the scene for another potential war, this time with China in the Pacific. And of course, in the Middle East, we now have growing evidence of its efforts to actually facilitate, ultimately, a war with Iran, not a great power in the sense that China and Russia are great powers, but nonetheless a very important, indeed key regional power. Well, That already is bad enough. But the other point I'm now going to make follows from the first. If the overriding objective of foreign policy is to maintain and preserve peace, then if you are a great power, you need to understand that the way to preserve peace is by maintaining good relations, or at least cooperative relations with the other great powers. And the Biden administration has never done that. It appears, in fact, it has sought conflict with Russia, as we will see shortly, whenever there was a genuine opportunity for some kind of understanding to be reached with the Russians about the security situation in Europe or about the ending of the crisis in the Ukraine. The United States, the administration, instead chose escalation, turning Russia from a potential partner first into an adversary and now into an enemy. And it has been doing exactly the same in the Pacific with China. It has been systematically building up the military forces in Taiwan. It has been lending support to political leaders in Taiwan who've been talking about independence, or as the Chinese would say, secession from China. It has gone out of its way to tell China that it does not respect China's red line, even whilst pretending to the face of Chinese officials, including the Chinese President Xi Jinping, that it is actually doing otherwise. A deception which the Chinese, of course, have had no difficulty seeing through, and which has infuriated them exceedingly. So, relations with the two great powers, which were already difficult, have been made much worse by an administration that has sought to make them worse. And it's made no secret about this, because right from the first moment of its emergence, the administration was already talking about establishing leagues of democracies, a league of democracies to counter the league of autocracies, the autocracies being, of course, China and Russia. In other words, it was already creating dividing lines between them. It made systematic efforts in its first year to set up new international bodies that would somehow take the place of the United Nations and which would enable the United States, under the administration's leadership, to act in ways that would circumvent the veto powers of the Chinese and the Russians in the UN Security Council. It framed the whole international situation as some kind of great struggle between the League of Autocracies and the League of Democracies. And it went out of its way repeatedly, in repeated comments, to insult the leaders of the other great powers. So Xi Jinping was repeatedly referred to, called a dictator by the president himself. Well, and as to the things that President Putin of Russia has been called, well, I'm not even going to start on those. Suffice to say that many of the rude things that officials of the administration were saying about Putin, they began before the start of the special military operation, though they have escalated completely out of control since. And of course, inevitably again, this has created massive problems in the international system. And of course, it gets worse because the administration, in pursuit of this completely counterproductive policy of confrontation and belligerence, almost compulsive belligerence, has sought to deploy every single tool within America's toolkit that it could hold that it could find. Weapons supplies to Ukraine, weapons supplies to Taiwan, missile strikes inside Russia itself, despite the incredibly dangerous nature of that kind of action. And of course, sanctions, and still more sanctions, massive sanctions against Russia, which have not changed Russian policy, not assisted Ukraine, not brought about the collapse of the Russian economy as they were predicted to do. On the contrary, the Russian economy over the last 3 years has arguably only been strengthened. And sanctions against China, more sanctions against China, open attempts to deny China technological access to key technologies, talk about containing China, about creating barriers to China in the first island chain, about forging alliances against China with the other major economies of Asia, Japan and South Korea. Sanctions everywhere, all the time. There are so many sanctions that, quite apart from the fact that this has all had a serious impact on the efficient working of the global economy, it has also meant that there are now so many sanctions that I doubt that the United States itself any longer has any proper control or understanding of all of the sanctions that it has imposed. And these sanctions have not achieved any of the objectives that were set for them. As I said, the Russian economy has not collapsed. The Chinese economy continues to develop and grow. China continues to take the lead in all sorts of technological areas. But of course, it is provoking counter reactions. So the Chinese are now taking counter steps. They're now starting to restrict exports of special materials and heavy metals. The Russians are also starting to take steps of their own to safeguard their own economy from sanctions. The result has been growing inflationary pressures, stresses within the Western economies, within the economy of the United States as well. What we see, again, is a policy of covert war followed by the United States instead of the United States following the correct policy, which is to prioritize the preservation of peace. And we see again the effect that this is having on the economic system. In Europe, we now have a systemic crisis which is affecting all of the European economies. And in the United States, this crisis which we see in Europe is also present, even though reckless money emission has to some extent concealed the cracks. So, a policy of confrontation with the great powers and a refusal to see peace as the priority that a great power should accord to it. And it isn't just the other great powers, the other existing great powers with which the United States, as a result of the actions of this administration, is now in conflict. If relations with Russia are catastrophic and relations with China are becoming increasingly bad, so are relations with India as well. Again, the administration, as by the way, previous administrations, has had a deeply manipulative approach to India. Instead of valuing the relationship with India on its own terms as a relationship between a great nation, the United States, and another great nation, which is India, we have seen a constant attempt to use India to try to put pressure on China, drawing India into all kinds of thinly veiled alliances against China. and also to use the Indians against Russia to try to manipulate the conduct of their foreign policy against Russia, and to exert warnings and threats to the Indians unless the Indians comply. And what we have seen, again, over the last 4 years, is that a country, India, and a government, the one led by Prime Minister Modi, which had been extremely well disposed to the United States, has instead become progressively alienated. The Indians have not broken with the United States, and it's most unlikely that they ever will in their own interests, but they're already becoming disenchanted with the United States. They see that American investment in their country has not lived up to expectations. They question why they should be drawn into a conflict with China, with which they admittedly have difficult relations, simply because the United States wants them to. And they question why they should be compelled to break relations or to enter into conflict with Russia, which has been their oldest, most consistent, and most reliable friend. And the Indians have also been facing all sorts of pressures on the diamond industry, which relates to which is concentrated in Prime Minister Modi's home state, on their oil industry, with restrictions now of the United States trying to restrict the export trade of Russian oil to India, an export trade from which India has benefited and which has helped India grow its economy. We've seen also attempts by the United States and other Western countries to bring up the topic of India's treatment of Sikh separatist leaders outside India and inside India. And, well, India also gradually, as a result, has started to question the partnership it believed it had with the United States. They are apparently particularly incensed by US backing, and as the Indians, many in India also believe US support and assistance in the recent change of power in Bangladesh. And another country, India, a rising power, has been alienated as well and is starting to distance itself from the US and from the US system. And unsurprisingly, when you get a situation where one great power pits itself into conflict with all of the other great powers simultaneously, the other great powers do what one would expect them to do. They start comparing notes with each other and make common cause against the great power which they have come to see as the disruptor. This is exactly what happened in the first half of the 20th century, when the European great powers became increasingly concerned and exasperated about the actions of Germany. And even more so in some respects, it is what we're seeing today. So the other great powers increasingly putting aside their differences, working together to create mechanisms whose ultimate purpose is to protect them from the actions that could be taken against them by the Americans. And ultimately, that is what the BRICS is all about. And that is what the whole system of trading and financial structures that the BRICS are weaving together, that is what it is all about as well. It is about protecting the financial, economic, trading interests of all of these powers from interference and pressure from the United States so that all of these great powers can come together and grow their economies and trade with each other without constant American interference. Now, many people have made the point that the BRICS is not an alliance, and they say that this somehow makes the BRICS less powerful than the alliance systems that the United States currently leads. In fact, there is absolutely nothing unprecedented about the BRICS, about the fact that countries that come together sometimes don't want to form formal alliances, but nonetheless work together to contain another great power. The Entente Cordiale between France and Britain that emerged in the first decade of the 20th century was also initially not an alliance. Just saying. Yet France and Britain did in the end become military allies against the Germans in the First World War. And everybody knew when the Entente Cordiale was formed that even though it was not a formal alliance, it was intended ultimately as a type of insurance between the French and the British against the country that they both saw as the disruptor and the common enemy, which was, of course, Germany. So there it is. This is the legacy that the Biden administration has left to Donald Trump. This is the world that he now surveys. I saw a post that somebody put up on Twitter X some months ago, which before the recent election, which noted the fact that the Chinese and the Russians in particular were working together, and the United States seemed to be exerting pressure on both. And it said sarcastically that this is what you do, this is what all the great handbooks on the conduct of foreign policy and international diplomacy tell you to do. Put pressure on every one of your adversaries or your potential adversaries so that they all unite against you. And as I said, this is exactly, so it seems to me, what the Biden administration over the 4 years of its existence has in effect done. When the administration took office in 2021, BRICS was still mostly a club, a discussion group between China and Russia and other great powers. Brazil, India, now Nigeria, which has just become a partner country, Indonesia. But anyway, it was essentially a discussion group. At the core, there was already a much stronger relationship, the relationship between China and Russia, which had been evolving since the 1990s, and which, especially after the 2014 Ukraine crisis, began to evolve much faster and much further. But the BRICS overall at that time was still exactly the nebulous, amorphous discussion club that people said it was. Today, I don't think one can say that anymore. The BRICS, obviously, are at the beginning of a long journey. They have charted possible ways forward to establish alternative financial and trading systems. We don't know how far the development of these systems will go, but the point is that they're now talking about doing these things. They now have plans to doing these things, and back in 2021, the plans did not exist to anything like the extent that they do now. Well, there it is. That, in my opinion, is the overall legacy of the Biden administration. a legacy of an administration that has sought conflict instead of peace, that has made a point of exacerbating conflicts wherever it could, that is obsessed with achieving victories. It's obsessed with the mirage of victory over Russia, over China, over Iran, over who knows whom, wherever that might be. And which, as a result, has created an appalling, shocking mess, bringing together all of the US's adversaries, uniting them against it. Now, there is one individual who it is now increasingly clear has played the absolutely central role in all of this. Well, maybe central role is too strong. No doubt there have been many authors to this debacle. But there is one individual who does, it seems, stand out. That is not the president himself. Now, here I will say briefly that, in my opinion, even despite his many infirmities, which have been discussed and spoken about and written about exhaustively, I think the president has been generally aware of most of what has been going on, and he has approved it. I don't think that anything has happened which went against his preferences or would have gone against his preferences had he been a healthier, more vigorous man. But it's clear to me increasingly, and the media is increasingly saying this, that one person nonetheless did play an outsized role in this disaster, and that, of course, was the Secretary of State, Tony Blinken. And there's now been an article which is in the New York Times, which says how Tony Blinken transformed the Department of State into the Department of War. He was seeking war in every place. Now, the focus here is actually Ukraine and Blinken's opposition to talk of getting negotiations started to end the conflict in Ukraine in November 2022, when they were proposed by the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Milley. Well, in fact, it is far worse than that. Blinken, in my opinion, played an absolutely seminal role in causing the war in Ukraine to begin in the first place. His obvious hostility to Russia was pretty much manifest from the first day. He turned up in Kiev, I remember, in the spring of 2021, when there were already tensions over Donbass, and appeared to give Zelensky and the government in Kiev assurances of unlimited support, assurances which to some extent the president at that time walked back. But perhaps the most disastrous intervention that he made took place in January 2021. At that place, 2022. At that time, the Russians were proposing two treaties to the United States, which, as is now clear, were intended to set up some kind of detailed negotiation with the Americans, which would avert a war in Ukraine, where the Russians were becoming increasingly concerned that US policy was to bring Ukraine into NATO and to convert Ukraine into a bridgehead against Russia. And there were discussions at that time between the President of the United States, President Biden, and the Russian President Vladimir Putin. And the Russians came away from a virtual discussion between Putin and Biden, believing, understanding that Biden had given them a promise that the United States would not establish missile bases in Ukraine. And apparently, and I've heard this now from various sources, and it's been discussed in open sources in several places, apparently the Russians were massively relieved. They saw this promise from Biden as a breakthrough. Obviously, there was a huge amount still to work out and do. It's by no means certain that a settlement between the United States and Russia over Ukraine could be found, but it was seen by the Russians as a signal that the United States was looking for a compromise and was serious about negotiating. And then Blinken had a meeting with the Russian Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov, and as is now universally acknowledged, he walked the concession back. He said that President Biden had not made or had not intended to make the concession about missile bases in Ukraine, that he did, that there was a misunderstanding or a mistake, and that the United States would simply agree what it would do with Ukraine, and it was none of Russia's business. And from that moment on, the Russians appear to have concluded that a settlement of the conflict in Ukraine with the Americans, with Biden, with the administration, was effectively impossible. And the drift towards war began in earnest. Well, thereafter, as has now also become clear, Blinken played the absolutely key role in blocking all steps towards negotiation of the settlement in Ukraine. Now, there continues to be a huge debate carried out in academic circles, on the internet, about whether President Putin was right to launch the special military operation in February 2022. I don't think there will ever be a final consensus about this. But what I'm going to say is this. Whatever it was, whatever you may think about Putin's decision in February 2022, it's not seriously possible to say that he started the war in February 2022. He launched the special military operation in 2022 as a last resort. On the contrary, the decision to launch the special operation in February 2022 was the product of 20 previous years of steadily deteriorating relations between the West and Russia, in which the Russians were becoming increasingly frustrated and alarmed that promises that had been made to them about NATO entry of the East European states, about the non-establishment of military bases in Eastern Europe, about agreements, the scrapping of agreements on intermediate nuclear forces and on anti-ballistic missiles. The Russians were becoming increasingly concerned about all of these moves by the West, and by the fact that the West would never listen to any objections that the Russians were making. And the Russians were also deeply concerned and deeply frustrated that their various efforts to stabilize the situation in Ukraine were being disregarded as well. This goes all the way back to an agreement that the Russians brokered between the former president of Ukraine, Viktor Yanukovych, who was overthrown in the February 2021 crisis, and an agreement between Yanukovych and the opposition. That agreement was scrapped within a few hours, with the opposition disregarding the agreement and acting to overthrow Yanukovych, something which infuriated the Russians exceedingly. Then there was the failure of negotiations that the Russians engaged in, first with the Americans, a meeting with Secretary Kerry and Foreign Minister Lavrov in London in March 2022. I remember it. Seeing the meeting, seeing the two foreign ministers in London at that time, when they seemed to have reached some kind of understanding over Ukraine, except that it turned out that they hadn't. And then the Russians were deeply frustrated with further conflicts. They were frustrated about the fact that the Germans and the French, as Lavrov has recently discussed at great length, failed to honor guarantees that they had given to the Russians at the time of the signing of the Minsk agreement in 2015. Another agreement largely brokered by the Russians. The Germans and the French said that they would see it done, and it never was done. And then, of course, the Russians were further infuriated because subsequently the West not only went back on the Minsk agreement, but as has become now clear, began to arm and support Ukraine before the special military operation began. So by this point, Russian trust of what the West was saying was becoming exhausted, and Russian concern about what the West was saying was becoming exhausted as well. And I think that over and above Blinken's retraction of the apparent concession on missile bases in Ukraine, the Russians were also deeply alarmed by speeches made at the Munich Security Conference, including by Zelensky, in which he appeared to float the possibility of Ukraine one day acquiring nuclear weapons. So the special military operation began, but it is important to say that the Russians did not give up on coercive diplomacy even at that time. We now know that on the very day when the special military operation began, the Russians contacted the Ukrainians and suggested direct talks. And those talks continued throughout March, and in April they resulted in an agreement. Well, there's been a vast amount written and said about Boris Johnson's role in wrecking that agreement, but it now looks as if Tony Blinken had an at least equivalent role. And ever since then, he has exacerbated the situation in Ukraine. He rejected, as I said, General Milley's suggestion that negotiations begin in November 2022. He pressed forward for total victory over the Russians. He was apparently instrumental in pulling everybody together to launch the offensive, the Ukrainian offensive against the Russians in the summer of 2023, which failed catastrophically. After the failure of the offensive in 2023, Blinken learnt absolutely nothing. He seems to have been the main advocate of missile strikes deep inside Russia. He got the British and the French on side with that, overriding what the Pentagon was thinking. At every point in this conflict, Blinken, the Ukraine conflict, Blinken has acted as a spoiler with respect to any and every attempt to achieve peace. And it's been the same with the Middle East. We now have growing information. It's still very tentative and there's still an awful lot to learn, but it's now absolutely clear that even as Biden and Blinken were saying that they were taking steps to try to restrain the Israelis, the reality was exactly otherwise. Stephen Walt has now come forward and said that what we were exposed to was in effect a smokescreen in which the Biden administration and Blinken himself did everything they possibly could to lead us all into thinking that they were trying to restrain the Israelis, whereas in fact they persisted in giving the Israelis a blank check. And, well, I remember how in the first weeks after the Israeli military operation in Gaza began, Blinken actually went on a tour of Middle East states. He visited Egypt and Jordan and actually tried to persuade the Egyptians and the Jordanians to agree to mass displacements of the population of Gaza from Gaza to their territories, something which, unsurprisingly, the Egyptians and the Jordanians categorically rejected. So Blinken has played an absolutely key role in creating the crisis and prolonging the crisis in the Middle East. He has also apparently orchestrated a lot of the media and diplomatic campaigns we have seen against Iran. And last but not least, he has also repeatedly angered and annoyed the Chinese as well over the question of Taiwan and other matters. It would be difficult to find a foreign minister not just as incompetent as Tony Blinken, but as disconnected from the necessities and needs of the modern world as Tony Blinken has been. Anyway, there we are. This is what I'm going to say about the Biden administration. I don't want to return to this topic again. I hope that the new administration will understand what I have said about the secret of geopolitics at this particular time. The secret of geopolitics is actually very simple. It is to prioritize the preservation of peace. Peace between the great powers by understanding that each great power has its red lines. The United States has them. So, of course, do the Russians and the Chinese and the Indians and others as well. Respect red lines, work with the other great powers to try to resolve crises, preserve dialogue, do, in other words, the diametric opposite of what Blinken and Biden and, of course, Jake Sullivan have been doing. Well, there we are. Let's now look at what might happen now that this administration is departing the scene. Departing the scene, I should say, to the relief of most of the world. Some people in Europe regret its passing and fear the coming of Donald Trump. Opinion polls show that in the rest of the world, the sentiment is diametrically otherwise. But anyway, let's see what might happen. Now, we have reports this morning that President Trump has now authorized his officials over the next few hours to contact directly the Kremlin to make arrangements for an early telephone conversation between himself and Vladimir Putin, leading to a summit meeting at which President Trump apparently hopes to discuss Ukraine and to see whether there's any route towards achieving some kind of a settlement of the conflict over Ukraine. So that is an essential and very necessary first step. We will see where it goes. We have also reports that President Trump apparently also wants a meeting with Xi Jinping. And there are even suggestions that he's prepared to have that meeting in China. Importantly, he is refusing for the moment to meet with President Zelensky. Now, President Zelensky is now spreading a story that he's far too busy to attend Donald Trump's inauguration and that it was his decision not to go. The president's son, Donald Trump Jr., has ridiculed this claim. He said that on 3 occasions Zelensky indicated that he did indeed want to come. It was the Americans, the Trump team, who didn't want him there. And, well, yesterday in my program, I discussed at great length the terrifying plans, the idiotic and terrifying plans that the Ukrainians and the British seem to be hatching together in order to try to derail peace talks in Ukraine and to prolong the war there. And, well, we have reports now that the administration, actually the Trump administration, wants to keep Britain at a distance, or at least the Starmer government. There's been a long article about this in the Mail on in the Daily Mail. They're saying that Starmer is going to be put to the back of the queue, that the Trump people have little time for him personally, and that they are giving serious thought to blocking Lord Mandelson's appointment as ambassador to the United States. All of which, by the way, and it depresses me to say this as a British citizen about the Prime Minister of my own country, all of these moves, in my opinion, are good moves. And, well, there's been an awful lot of discussion about possible deals and compromises and negotiations between the Americans and the Russians about ending Ukraine. There have been all sorts of elaborate proposals and plans suggested about how that could be done. All I would say about that is that before negotiations between the Russians and the Americans can really move forward about resolving the situation in Ukraine, the Americans need to get to first base, which is to have some full and frank discussions with their own allies, the British, obviously, the French also, but the Ukrainians as well. Because as of this time, there is nothing at all that suggests that Zelensky and his people in Kiev are interested in negotiations with the Russians. As I discussed in my program yesterday, their entire plan at the present time is to try to draw the Americans one way or the other into the war so that the Americans can become directly involved as a pathway to Ukraine, which is losing the war, achieving victory. Now, unless this outlook changes, unless the perspective in Kiev and in European capitals changes, it's very, very difficult to see how this can move past first base. Now, the commentator, who I know as Aurélien, has written a lengthy piece, which I partly agree with, partly don't agree with. There's many things there, but he does make the absolutely correct observation, one I wholly endorse, which is that no agreement can ever succeed unless there is good faith between the parties. Whatever the format of an agreement, whatever the details of the agreement, if one side is not interested in implementing it, sooner or later it will break down. Now, anybody who is observing what the Ukrainians are saying at the present time, what the British are saying at the present time, can see that conditions for a constructive negotiation on how to end this conflict are really all but impossible. The first thing the Americans are going to have to do after they met with the Russians and got a better sense of what the Russians are prepared to do. The first thing the Americans need to do is to have that discussion with their allies, with Zelensky and the French and the British, to explain to them that this really is over, that America really is serious about the war ending now, and that their pursuit of victory is a mirage and not one that is going to be backed in any form by the United States. I have to say that I cannot see how that can happen whilst Zelensky remains in power in Kiev. Just saying. But anyway, the administration, at least for the moment, appears to be making the correct moves. And people who are not actually a part of the administration, but who nonetheless have connections, historic connections with Trump, which I believe are more than historic. I'm referring now to Steve Bannon, who apparently is still in contact with Trump. Anyway, Steve Bannon has absolutely correctly said that if the United States under Donald Trump recommits to the war in Ukraine, then this will become Donald Trump's Vietnam. He will find that he has no time to address other questions, and when defeat inevitably comes, he will own it. And Bannon is absolutely right. I've made the comparisons with the conflict in Vietnam many times in programs on this channel. It is refreshing to see that someone as close to Trump as Steve Bannon has apparently recognized that. So there we go. We are looking at what the administration might do. We'll see what they manage to do. I hope that in foreign policy they do present an actual break with the administration that, well, as of the time of making of this program, we still have. Now, here it's important again to reiterate the point I have made many times. The Russians are winning the war in Ukraine. In fact, they're not just winning the war in Ukraine. In military terms, they have already done so. There is still massive denial about this in many places, but it is, in my opinion, unequivocally true. Just before I started making this program, I saw a report that Velikaya Novosilka has fallen, that it has passed fully under Russian control. I'm not absolutely sure that that is necessarily the case, but it could very well be. And we've also had other reports about the collapse of the Ukrainian military position in the area of Pokrovsk. This is from Ukrainska Pravda, Ukrainian newspaper. Chaos in the management of troops and units at various levels has persisted for almost a year. We read that in the Pokrovsk area and in other areas of the battlefield, depleted brigades do not receive reinforcements, while freshly formed units quickly lose men and equipment due to lack of experience and thin out through desertion. And that there's been one retreat after another. We have comments from Sergei Filimonov, commander of the 108th Separate Mechanized Battalion Da Vinci Wolves, which is part of the armed forces of Ukraine. He says that there is no communication with some outposts. There is one position that only gets in touch when they catch internet service, as they use ordinary mobile internet instead of special communication means or Starlink. And we've already had complaints from other people like Yuri Butuzov, the Ukrainian commentator, Mariana Bezuglaya. all of them agree that the situation in Pakrovsk is becoming catastrophic. And in fact, there have been further reports. There were reports yesterday that Kotlivo, the village close on the southwest fringes of Pakrovsk, has fallen, and that Pakrovsk, to all intents and purposes today, is effectively surrounded. There's even been an article to that effect today in the Daily Telegraph, which actually says that Pakrovsk is mostly surrounded now by the Russians. Access to Pakrovsk is no longer possible. And, well, I've discussed the situation in other places, in Chasiv Yar, in Toretsk. I suspect that the Russians are simply delaying the end of the Battle of Toretsk until after Trump's inauguration. They won't want to announce the capture of Toretsk whilst Trump himself is inaugurated, something which would only annoy Trump. So I suspect they're delaying that until that's over and out of the way. Chasiv Yar looks like it's about to fall as well. And, well, it looks like in the Zherebets River area, the Russians have made further progress. They've managed to establish some time ago a bridgehead in a village called Ivanivka on the west bank of the Zherebets River. There are reports now that they are approaching, that they're on the outskirts of a village called Kolodyazy. If you look at where Kolodyazy is on the map, you see that it is extremely close to Liman and other places which the Russians control. Terny, just east of Kolodyazy, on the east bank of the Zherebets River. There's reports that the Russians are now fighting for Yampolivka. There are confused reports about whether the Russians control the other village of Torske on the east bank of the Zherebets River. But one way or the other, the Russians are very close to Liman again. Well, these are, on the face of it, minor battles, but they all tell the same story of a rapidly deteriorating military situation for Ukraine and of an army, a Ukrainian army, which is overextended and exhausted and is running out of men and of supplies. And there is no mechanism, no means that can reverse this. Now, there is this pressure to apply sanctions on Russia. There's been talk about how if there are more oil sanctions, that would cause the Russian economy to implode in some way. More oil sanctions, which is certainly not true. There's been a long article in in The Bell. The Bell, I should say, is a magazine which covers Russian affairs. I'm not myself, in most respects, a huge fan. As I said, it's very, very critical of the Putin government, or mostly is. But it addresses those scaremongering claims that I talked about a short time ago by people like Craig Kennedy and Ambrose Evans Pritchard, that the Russians are financing the war through forcing domestic banks to overlend to the military industries, that this is all really the mechanism whereby the war is being funded, and that this is setting up Russia eventually for a financial crisis, which would supposedly bring the whole Russian economy cascading down. Martin Sandbu wrote a similar piece, that the Russian economy is a house of cards. Well, The Bell has addressed this point. Now, a couple of days ago, when all of these claims first started to appear, I said that they were simply wrong, that far from bank lending being a mechanism that the Russian government was using to fund the war, on the contrary, the Russian government was trying to reduce bank lending. Commercial lending in Russia is not, in fact, expanding. It is currently reducing. But the Bell has gone into this more deeply than I have done. And, well, they've looked into the whole issue and they've come back and they said that this whole analysis, straight out, is simply wrong. And I'll just read some of what it says. According to the central bank, the overall increase in corporate loans since 2022 is no more than $300 billion. That's far less than the $415 billion cited by alarmists. More importantly, about 2/3 of this is a result of companies replacing foreign currency debt with ruble debt after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. These new ruble loans are at higher interest rates, but eliminate currency risks. They cannot be regarded as war loans. More importantly, this is all from the Bell, it's wrong to add this money to official spending figures. All credit subsidies are already reflected in budget data. For example, in the state armaments program, the program to support small and medium-sized enterprises, agricultural producers, and others. If the corporate loan portfolio has expanded rapidly in the last 2 years, it's not a given that this expansion will continue. Indeed, there were signs that corporate borrowing was beginning to slow in November and December. I made the point previously that that is what the central bank has previously said. And we then go on to read, according to the central bank, the bulk of Russia's subsidized loan portfolio is made up of developers using the subsidized mortgage scheme that ended on July 1st. All these loans cannot simply be branded as bad debt. The rates on subsidized loans for developers are heavily dependent on the availability of company funds in escrow accounts. In other words, money received from buyers of future apartments and effectively owned by the bank is financing construction. If the total funds in the escrow accounts is close to 100% of the requested loan, banks are willing to issue loans at low rates since there is guaranteed collateral. And it is emphatically not only the defense sector that is borrowing in Russia right now. Most new loans in Russia are currently being taken up by companies working in wholesale and retail trade, transport and communication, construction, real estate, petroleum and finished products. Only the last of these is significantly linked to the defense sector. So the whole narrative is wrong. Now, one wonders why these stories are spread. Perhaps it's partly intended to cause destabilization in Russia itself. Many of these stories have been relayed back into Russia and they have been reported there, and they did cause some concern, though the central bank and the finance ministry have acted quickly to squelch them, and I don't think this is going to have any significant effect in how the economy develops from this point onwards. Or it could be, and probably is, that people like Martin Sandbu and Craig Kennedy and Ambrose Evans Pritchard, what they're trying to do is to keep the Trump administration persisting with the sanctions policy. The continued illusion that the sanctions policy is more successful than it really is, hoping that if you just keep up the pressure for a few more months, well, the Russian economy is just a house of cards and it will start to break down. And we don't really need to make any concessions, because if we just hold on just a little longer, it will all come right. We will see that the sanctions were successful after all. So we don't need to make any concessions or negotiate with the Russians in any serious way, because actually their economy, despite all appearances, is bound to collapse. So I'm sure that an element of that agenda is certainly there. But I also believe that what we are also seeing is denialism. Western economic commentators and thinkers and think tankers and others who have invested massively in the whole sanctions policy, who have been telling themselves for years that Russia is a one-dimensional economy, that is a gas station masquerading as a country. They've been saying to each other this for so long that they still can't quite believe it isn't so. They still want to believe that something is about to happen that will vindicate their belief after all. So they cherry pick the data. They see that corporate lending in Russia has increased. They don't see this as a sign of a surge in investment, partly brought about by the sanctions. They see this instead as money printing in order to keep the war going. And they tell themselves that this is about to collapse in a banking crisis and hyperinflation. Well, none of this is going to help Ukraine or the West. It's not going to lead us into victory in the war. Serious negotiations perhaps can mitigate the damage, but it is important to say that the Russians are continuing to advance, and that the negotiations, any negotiations, if they're going to have any prospect of success at all, will depend heavily on acknowledging that fact. That doesn't mean that the Russians are going to close the door on negotiations entirely. Shortly before I started making this program, the Kremlin confirmed that Putin is absolutely willing to meet and speak to Trump and to engage with him in a substantive dialogue about Ukraine. I go back to that point which Eve Smith made a while back, an article that she wrote a while back, in which she pointed out that for the Russians, a situation where they occupy the whole of Ukraine but have no security on their western border remains an unsatisfactory one, and that they might prefer to compromise with the United States about Ukraine in order to achieve that final conclusive settlement which will guarantee the security of their western border, which, as far as the Russians are concerned, is what this war is principally about. But to repeat again, if people go into negotiations with the Russians, making with expectations that the Russians can be bought or bullied into making substantive concessions far beyond those that they have been prepared to make in the past, to capitulate, in other words, they are not going to. They are not under pressure to. They're under no military pressure to. Sanctions pressure, they have shrugged off in the past, and they are confident, almost certainly correctly, that they will be able to shrug off again in the future. And besides, when Russian leaders see the kind of document that Keir Starmer has come away with from Kiev, where he recently met with Zelensky, the 100-year agreement that I've discussed over the course of 2 programs. Why would the Russians compromise when they are faced with implacable hostility like that? So, a realistic approach to foreign policy, one that takes into account the realities. We've seen first steps, perhaps, with the agreement for a ceasefire in Gaza, which appears for the moment to be generally holding. We've seen that with Donald Trump's apparent rejection of plans to launch missile strikes against Iran in the first weeks of his presidency. We see that in President Trump's decision to have meetings with Xi Jinping and with Vladimir Putin as soon as possible. We see that perhaps in these reports that Trump has decided to keep Starmer and people like him at a distance. The road to peace in Europe, let's put aside a little Ukraine. The road to peace in Europe is going to be stony and twisting, and it's littered with mines that the Biden administration has left behind. It will not be an easy journey to take, but let us at least hope that the present administration is going to start on it. Well, this is where I finish my program today, a little shorter than usual and perhaps more impressionistic. I am not somebody who particularly likes broad sweep discussions, I should say, but this is one that at the end of one disastrous administration and at the beginning of another, I feel obliged to make. In my program tomorrow, I predict I will return to more usual things, more usual topics. We'll see what diplomatic moves are going to be made, even as the war grinds on, and as far as the Russians are concerned, grinds on to victory. So that's my program for today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by checking out our shop, links under this video. Don't forget also that you can support our work by checking your subscription to this channel and by ticking the like button if you've liked this video. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.